Week 11 of fantasy football season. Here's a few players that look to sell and trade this week. So right now with the trade deadline coming up this week in some fantasy leagues, and next week, this is the end pretty much for fantasy owners to trade before next season, unless obviously you're in a dynasty league or a keeper league. Anyway, the first player, Bennie Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons. So Bennie Robinson finally got back on track after the last month of the season. We really didn't see much out of him, so we had a good game in Week 10 and a big workload. 22 carries, 95 yards, a touchdown, a catch, 11 yards. But now going on by is this Atlanta Falcon team, and two tougher matchups coming up in Week 12 and Week 13. Week 12 versus New Orleans, the third least amount of fantasy points to running backs on the season. And then you got a matchup at the New York Jets where they're a stout run defense and one of the better defenses in the league. So right now, a lot of factors where Bennie Robinson, I don't think will be as effective. He's one of the worst head coaches in the league all season. I think he's mishandled the workload here for Bijan, and we're already looking at Week 11 where time is running out for him to really be a big fantasy factor this season. And now with Taylor Heineke banged up with a hamstring injury as well. We know Desmond Ridder, he's definitely hurt everyone's value on this team. So with all those factors and going into a bye, I think this is a perfect time to sell Bijan. After he had the best game he had in the last month of the season, next play is Devin Singletary in Texans. So Devin Singletary, I know, is a hot pickup off the waiver wire. But if you could pick up a guy off the waiver wire, or if you had him on your roster and sell him off after the great game for something with more consistency and a team need, this is a great time to do it. So Singletary had the monster game at Cincinnati, 30 carries, 150 yards, a rushing touchdown, a catch, 11 yards. And after a performance like that, he's definitely going to be the favorite, I believe, for this Houston Texan team to be the starting running back over Dameon Pierce. Because Dameon Pierce, pretty much this season, he's been a touchdown-dependent running back. I know Dameon Pierce, the last few weeks where Pierce banged up and injured, has taken his spot and hasn't played well until that big game. So selling him off one big game is definitely a possibility with more teams coming up on bye over the next few weeks, obviously. And running back being a pretty tough position this season with a lot of busts and just a lot of guys underperforming. This is a perfect time if you picked up Singletary, or you're going to pick him up and flip him in a deal, because this is probably the best game we're going to see all season from Singletary. The next play is Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. And Chris Olave, believe it or not, I thought he played a better game with Jameis Winston and his gunslinger mentality than he has most of the season with Derek Carr. So the last 2 weeks he's gotten back on track is Chris Olave. Week 9 versus Chicago, 6 catches, 46 yards, and a touchdown. In Week 10, a big game in Minnesota, 6 catches, 94 yards, and a touch. So Week 11 was a bye week now coming up for this New Orleans Saints team. Then they got a game at the Falcons, the Detroit Lions, and the Panthers. So a pretty solid schedule, but I think with Jameis Winston in the lineup, it could be sky's the limit. But now with the bye week and most likely Derek Carr coming back, I think Olave, where he was drafted, hasn't pretty much played up to the value for that as fantasy owners. He's second rounder in most fantasy drafts, but right now he's playing as a fourth, fifth rounder for the majority of the season. So after coming off of 2 good games, and now it was with Jameis Winston one of these ball games, I think he could take a step back a little bit with Derek Carr if he returns after the bye week, and he's a sell-high candidate. I'm not saying to trade these players just for anything, just to make a trade before the trade deadline in your fantasy leagues. But if you could get good value, and especially if you could trade a Chris Olave, let's say, for maybe a top running back like a Jahmyr Gibbs or something, that's the type of deal fantasy owners should go out there and make. The next play is Dak Prescott of the Dallas Cowboys. He's been playing like a man possessed over the last month of the season, is Dak Prescott. And this Cowboy offense is really taking off after the first 4 or 5 weeks of the year. They really haven't done much, so he's been on a 4-game tear, is Prescott. Week 6 at the Chargers, 272 pass yards, a touchdown, 40 rush yards, a touchdown. Week 8 versus the Rams, 304 pass yards, 4 touchdowns, an INT, 19 rush yards. Week 9 at Philly, 374 pass yards, 3 touchdowns. And Week 10 versus the Giants, he only played 3 quarters in that game, and he went off 404 pass yards, 4 touchdowns, an interception, 17 rush yards, and a rushing touchdown. So right now, Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb, they're one of the more dangerous combinations in the league right now over the last month of the season. Prescott, he's got a lot of confidence. He's making all the throws, and he's going out there and stepping up in the pocket. Brandon Cooks, he got involved in last week's game. Jake Ferguson's been a mainstay with CeeDee Lamb, but I just don't buy that Dak Prescott is going to keep these numbers up at this high of a level. We saw it a few seasons ago where he had some good games and then some games where he fizzled out after going on a tear. So like I said, Dak Prescott, the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season wasn't really doing much, where he only had one game of 20 or more fantasy points. But the last few weeks here, games in a row with 25 or more fantasy points, and including the last 3 games where he's had 30 or more fantasy points, is Dak Prescott, including a monster ball game with 45 fantasy points in Week 10. So right now, I know he's got a favorable schedule coming up. I think right now you could trade Dak Prescott and get a top 10, 15 running back. And I'd rather have a good running back than a Prescott right now, because running back's harder to come than a quarterback. And I just don't believe Dak Prescott's going to keep up these elite numbers, even though the last month of the season he's definitely put in those big performances. The next play is David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions. So David Montgomery, he's been a solid running back this season, but injuries have been a concern on and off for him over the last few seasons. And even this season, we've seen Montgomery already miss 3 ball games this year. So right now, Jahmyr Gibbs looks like the star back over there for the Lion team. A 75-yard run in Week 10 definitely saved Montgomery's game. We had 12 carries, 116 yards, and a touchdown. And Jahmyr Gibbs, he had most of the goal line work where he found the end zone twice in that game. So I know Montgomery's got a good schedule coming up, but now Gibbs looks like the leader in the backfield, more explosive running back. And if he didn't have that 75-yard run, his fantasy day pretty much was 6-7 fantasy points at most for Montgomery. So right now, where it looks like it's Gibbs' backfield, this is a perfect time to trade David Montgomery. I think he's still a solid number 2 running back for fantasy owners, but the work's going to go down, and he's going to need some big plays for him to keep up some elite numbers. So he's definitely a sell-high candidate after coming back and finding the end zone and going over 100 yards in that Week 10 game at the Los Angeles Chargers. Next play is Devonte Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders. Adams had one of the best games he's had in a long time with 14.5 fantasy points, but pretty much his ceiling isn't that high anymore. I think with Aiden O'Connell, a quarterback, 6 catches, 86 yards he had versus the New York Jets. In Week 11, it's going to be another tougher matchup as well at the Miami Dolphins at Week 11, where you got Jalen Ramsey back in the lineup over the last few weeks, but this bye week's definitely going to help him to get healthy and almost 100% as well. And Xavier Howard back as well. So right now, O'Connell, he looked decent at times, force-feeding Adams early in the game. But like I said, his ceiling's pretty much 15, 18 fantasy points as most is Devonte Adams. And besides one monster game this season, pretty much a lot of bad ball games and a couple decent games here and there. So right now, after he finally had a double-digit game after 3 weeks and not doing much as Adams, this is a perfect time to sell him high, because I don't really like his ceiling. I don't like the offensive line for the Raiders or the quarterback as well. And I think this Raider team is going to be a run-first team as well for the majority of the season with Josh Jacobs. And we saw it a lot over the last 2 weeks since Antonio Pierce has been the head coach. And the final player I look to sell and trade this week is Brian Robinson of the Washington Commanders. So Brian Robinson, he's had some pop games this season, but definitely it was a fluky game in that Week 10 loss at the Seattle Seahawks, where he had 8 carries, 38 yards, but he did his damage in the air, 6 catches, 119 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So right now we know he's not much of a receiver. We know the receiving back is Antonio Gibson, where he found the end zone once again on a little out route in the corner of the end zone for this Commander team. And Brian Robinson, he's been a touchdown-dependent running back this season. So right now, after a monster game where he had 27 fantasy points in PPR leagues, this is a perfect time to sell him high, because the last few weeks before that, he pretty much was scoring only anywhere from 9 to 13 fantasy points. If you could get a nice wide receiver in a deal or another running back here for Brian Robinson, this would be the time to do it. Even though Robinson's been a solid number 2 running back this season, I just don't like the consistency for him, where it's pretty much a touchdown or bust. So that's a few plays I look to sell and trade in Week 11 of the fantasy football season.